The first thing he noticed when the shuttle docked was that the station did not feel like metal. It felt like a thought trying to pretend it was architecture. The docking corridor flexed subtly as he walked, recalibrating its own gravity in response to his footsteps, as if the station was deciding whether he deserved to stay upright. Somewhere behind the walls, something clicked like a polite apology. Humans were still rare enough in this sector that most infrastructure behaved like it was hosting an uninvited but potentially interesting guest. He adjusted the strap of his field recorder and told himself for the third time that he was here for xenobiology observation, not politics, not diplomacy. Definitely not anything involving assassination attempts, because that was explicitly outside the job description he had signed after skimming it in a cafeteria that served questionable algae noodles. The corridor opened into the inner convergence hall and the air changed texture. It wasn't just filtered, it was curated. Each breath carried a faint variance in ionization depending on proximity to different delegations. To his left, a cluster of crystalline-bodied envoys shimmered in synchronized patterns that might have been greetings or mild threats. To his right, something resembling a floating botanical archive released spores that translated into sound waves, producing a kind of music that made him feel like he was forgetting an appointment he never agreed to. He stepped forward carefully, trying not to look like someone who was constantly calculating whether floors were judging him. A hovering drone drifted past his shoulder. Observer designation. Human subclass diplomatic adjunct, it said in a tone that suggested it had already filed complaints about him. Please avoid direct contact with sovereign surfaces. I will do my best, he muttered. No touching the sovereign surfaces, got it. I assume touching is like extremely illegal touching or just mildly frowned upon touching. The drone paused, its lights flickered as if reconsidering the concept of humor. Clarification. All touching is illegal unless explicitly invited by a sovereign entity. That tracks, he said. Very efficient society you've got here. The drone moved on, apparently unwilling to engage further with sarcasm-based life forms. That was when he saw her. She stood at the center of the hall where the lighting bent slightly inward, as if the space itself had developed an instinct for orbit. She did not announce herself the way the others did, with sound or shimmer or scent-coded authority signals. Instead, everything around her simply behaved differently, like reality had quietly decided to pay attention. She looked human at first glance, but only in the way a distant memory looks like a face. Her proportions were familiar enough to be disarming, but her ears were not. They were long, elegant structures that curved slightly backward, tapering into thin, luminous edges that shifted color with subtle emotional precision. At rest, they were pale silver. When she turned her head slightly toward a subordinate who spoke too loudly, they warmed into a warning gold. The subordinate immediately remembered silence. Someone nearby whispered, "That is Her Majesty." He almost dropped his recorder. He had read about her before arriving, of course. Everyone had. The Queen of the Outer Convergence Territories, sovereign of treaty-stable systems, architect of the Trinary Accord. The kind of figure whose presence made entire star charts reorganize themselves just to avoid misrepresentation. And now she was standing less than 30 meters away, looking mildly bored. Which he suspected was how gods looked when waiting for paperwork. He shifted his weight, trying to look like a professional observer instead of someone who had accidentally wandered into a living myth. That was when he noticed the ceremonial procession beginning. A long table of suspended light unfolded across the hall, assembling itself out of coordinated drone swarms and gravitational scaffolding. At its center, a chalice was carried forward by 4 armored attendants whose movements were so synchronized they might have been a single organism negotiating with itself. The chalice was said to stabilize intersystem treaties for a full cycle decade per ceremonial ingestion. He had read that in the briefing notes and immediately suspected it was either metaphor or a deeply optimistic form of biochemistry. The Queen approached it, and then something in his field recorder chirped, not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, insistent diagnostic tone that said, "Hey, this looks wrong and also possibly illegal in 12 jurisdictions." He frowned, tapping the device. The liquid inside the chalice shimmered in a way that did not match baseline stabilizing compounds. The spectral signature had a distortion pattern, subtle, layered, engineered to appear as normal ceremonial variants but resolving into something far more deliberate under harmonic expansion. His stomach made a decision before his brain did. "That's poisoned," he said. He did not mean to say it out loud. Unfortunately, his vocal cords were not consulted in advance. The hall stopped, not like silence. Silence was normal in places like this. This was something more abrupt, like the concept of sound had been briefly removed for inspection. Every head turned toward him. One of the crystalline envoys tilted sideways as if trying to understand whether he was a malfunction or a performance piece. The drone from earlier reappeared instantly. "Clarify statement," it demanded. He swallowed. The drink. "It's contaminated. Biochemical interference pattern suggests delayed enzymatic trigger designed to translate," someone snapped from the crowd. "It's poisoned," he repeated more carefully. Then, because he had already committed to chaos, he added, "like really specifically poisoned." Someone put effort into this. Respectfully, that's kind of impressive in a terrible way. A ripple moved through the court, not fear yet, worse. Recalculation. The queen did not react immediately. That was what unsettled him most. She simply looked at him, her long ears shifting slightly. The color moved through them like a slow algorithm testing possibilities, silver, then faint blue, then something closer to violet curiosity. "You are certain," she said. It wasn't a question of belief. It was a question of whether his existence qualified as a relevant data source. He nodded. "Fairly certain. I've seen this kind of pattern before in lab simulations, though usually on microbes that are less politically motivated." A few officials stiffened at that. One of them whispered urgently into a communication lattice. He caught fragments. "Human interference, possible fabrication, and should we eliminate?" The queen raised one hand slightly. The room obeyed. It annoyed him how well that worked. She stepped closer to the chalice. The air around it shifted as her proximity activated embedded verification fields. The liquid reacted, exposing layers of hidden structure like an image being forced into focus. The poison was real and elegantly designed, too elegant for accident. A pause stretched. Then, unexpectedly, the queen exhaled what might have been amusement. "Well," she said, "someone has attempted to make my day interesting." Her ears flickered faint gold. The court did not laugh. He did, a little too quickly. "I mean, mission accomplished, from a certain perspective, not a good perspective, obviously. More like a please do not assassinate your monarch during ceremonial diplomacy perspective." That earned him several new looks, most of them suggesting he had misunderstood the concept of survival. The queen turned slightly toward him again. "You interrupted a sovereign convergence with an accurate observation," she said. "That is statistically improbable. I also interrupt microwaves at home when I think they're thinking too loudly," he replied before he could stop himself. A pause, then faintly her ears shifted toward a lighter hue. Not quite laughter, but close enough that the room seemed briefly unsure whether it was still in danger. And somewhere in the recalculating silence of the hall, the first real fracture in the ceremony began to form. They did not arrest him immediately, which he later decided was either a sign of advanced civilization or a very elaborate waiting period before execution. Instead, two armored diplomatic drones positioned themselves beside him with the kind of polite precision that suggested they had been trained in etiquette first and violence second. One of them emitted a soft chime every time he moved, as if reminding him that his existence was currently under review. "I would like to state for the record," he said as they escorted him forward through a corridor that now felt significantly less welcoming than before, "that I have never successfully poisoned anything in my life. Not even a plant. I once killed a cactus by being emotionally inconsistent." No one responded. The drones did not appear programmed for emotional reassurance, or sarcasm, or cactus-related confessions. The corridor ahead opened into a transit spine lined with slow-moving gravity currents. He could feel them adjusting around his body, testing mass distribution, as if the station was politely asking whether he would prefer to float or regret his life choices at a stable walking pace. He chose walking. Eventually, they brought him into a chamber that was too clean to trust, not clean in the human sense like someone just wiped the table, clean in the sense that the concept of dirt had been legally discouraged here. At the center stood the queen. She was closer now, and the long ears were more expressive than anything else in the room. They shifted color in subtle gradients that made him suspect entire diplomatic treaties were being signed and revoked without anyone speaking. Right now, they were a controlled silver, which he had learned in the last 20 minutes meant, "We are not currently planning your immediate disassembly." A small win. The drones released him and withdrew without ceremony. He almost asked if that meant he was free, but decided not to test the optimism threshold of alien legal systems. "You may speak," the Queen said. He blinked. "That's generous." "It is efficient," she replied. "Right, efficiency. Love that for us?" Her ears flickered faintly, possibly amusement, possibly recalibrating whether he qualified as a diplomatic asset or a particularly talkative hazard. She stepped closer to him, and the air subtly changed pressure, as if the room was adjusting to a higher authority gradient. "The substance you identified," she said, "was not part of sanctioned ceremony protocols." "Yeah," he said carefully. "I got that impression. It was doing a very convincing job of pretending it belonged there, though, like someone wearing a very expensive disguise and still forgetting their shoes are from a different species." A pause. "I assume that is a metaphor," she said. "It is," he confirmed. "Mostly, I think. I'm still working out how metaphor survival works in interstellar politics." That earned something like a quiet hum from her, which he decided to interpret as approval rather than prelude to interrogation. Behind her, the chamber walls displayed slow-moving data streams, political alignments, treaty stability indexes, assassination probability forecasts that flickered between improbable and statistically inevitable. One of them spiked sharply when his name was introduced into the system. He noticed. He wished he had not. "So," he said, "hypothetically speaking, if I had not said anything, would that have been worse?" The Queen tilted her head slightly, her ears shifted toward a deep violet. "Yes, that's not a comforting yes. It is an accurate one." He nodded slowly. "Got it. Cool, 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 cool. Love accuracy." A faint pause. Then she said, "You disrupted a controlled succession vector." He frowned. "I'm sorry, I think I missed a few words there." "Succession vector?" A small movement in the air behind him suggested one of the political subunits reacting emotionally. "The chalice," she said, "was designed to initiate instability in my governance cycle." "Oh," he said, "so it wasn't just poisoned, it was politically flavored poison." "Yes, that's honestly kind of impressive in a terrifying way." Her ears flickered gold again. He was beginning to suspect gold meant she was entertained, which in any normal environment would be reassuring. Here, it felt like being evaluated by a smiling meteor. "You have drawn attention," she said. "I was trying to avoid attention," he replied. "That is, historically speaking, my strongest skill. I once avoided a group project for 3 consecutive semesters." "That is not relevant." It felt relevant emotionally. The Queen moved slightly closer again, and this time he noticed something beneath her authority presence, subtle but deliberate observation. Not just of him, but of how he reacted to being observed. "You did not hesitate," she said. "I did hesitate," he corrected. "I just hesitated out loud." A pause. One of the data streams behind her shifted. He caught a glimpse of probability modeling. Human interference response classified as unpredictable, non-hostile, high disruption potential. He raised a hand slightly. "For the record, I am usually much less disruptive. I can be very boring. I have references." The Queen studied him for a long moment, then she said something unexpected. "You are not from any faction." He blinked. "I'm from Earth. We mostly have traffic and arguments about breakfast." "That is not a faction structure." "No," he agreed. "It's more like organized confusion with recurring themes." A faint flicker of color in her ears again. Then she turned slightly as if addressing both him and the chamber itself. "Your identification of the interference was not predicted by any court model," she said. "That sounds like a polite way of saying I ruined someone's plan." "It is a precise way of saying that." He sighed. "Great. I love being precise chaos." A silence settled, not hostile, not friendly, evaluative. Then the Queen extended her hand, not toward him exactly, toward the space between them. A thin lattice of light unfolded from her fingertips, forming a structured interface that looked less like technology and more like law given physical form. He instinctively stepped back. Is that for me? He asked. Yes. That's usually where I get nervous. You should. He stared at it. That is not reassuring. It is honest. He appreciated that. Reluctantly, the interface hovered between them, waiting. What happens if I touch it? He asked. You will be registered. That sounds like a parking violation, but with higher stakes. A pause. Yes. He looked at her again. Do I get to know what I'm registering into, or is this one of those click accept to continue situations? Her ears flickered faint blue, subtle amusement again. You already interfered with sovereign security architecture, she said. You are now part of the response chain. That sounds like I've been promoted into paperwork. That is accurate, he sighed deeply. I would like it noted that on Earth, we usually get coffee before this level of life-altering bureaucracy. No coffee is required. That is the most alien sentence I have heard all day. The chamber remained still, waiting. Somewhere behind him, political subroutines were recalculating threat-response matrices based on his continued existence. He looked at the interface again. So, he said, just to confirm. If I do this, I become what? Officially inconvenient? The Queen considered, then she said, protected. A pause. That sounds better, he admitted. Still weird, but better. Her ears shifted faintly towards silver blue. Touch, she said. He hesitated. Then, because his life had apparently stopped respecting his ability to decline unusual requests, he reached out. The moment his fingers met the lattice, it did not feel like contact. It felt like recognition. A brief pulse ran through him, cold, precise, vast, and then something locked into place behind his awareness, like a system acknowledging a newly inserted variable. The chamber reacted instantly. Data streams surged. Security models recalibrated. Somewhere in the station, alarms did not trigger because they were politely overridden. He withdrew his hand quickly. Okay, he said, I think I just got emotionally installed into a government. The Queen watched him, her ears flickered gold again, and for the first time she smiled slightly. You are now within jurisdictional protection, she said. He stared at her. Is that good? For you, she replied, yes. A pause. For everyone else, she added, it depends on their behavior. He exhaled slowly. That is the least comforting reassurance I have ever received. I am improving. That's what worries me. After the bond activated, nothing dramatic happened immediately, which in his experience was always the most suspicious kind of dramatic. There were no explosions, no glowing symbols burned into the air, no sudden choir of alien voices announcing that reality had been permanently upgraded. Instead, the chamber simply accepted him, like a system adding a new file and pretending it had always been there. The Queen watched him for a long moment. Her ears shifted through a slow spectrum, silver, then faint indigo, then a soft gold that lingered longer than before. You are integrated, she said. He looked down at his hands as if expecting them to display a loading icon. That sounds like I've been successfully installed into government software. You have been registered within sovereign response architecture, she corrected. Right, that. Definitely less like software, more like being emotionally adopted by a very powerful spreadsheet. One of the nearby court officials made a sound that might have been outrage or fainting. It was hard to tell because both were common here. The Queen ignored them. That, he was beginning to realize, was one of her more dangerous abilities. You will remain under my jurisdictional protection, she continued. That sounds reassuring in a you are now a diplomatic liability with warranty coverage kind of way. Her ears flickered faint blue, amusement. He was getting better at reading it now, which he suspected was either growth or resignation. Outside the chamber, the consequences unfolded quickly. He did not see them all directly, but he felt them through the system now connected to him in a way he absolutely did not remember consenting to in detail. Assassination probability networks collapsed and reformed around his presence. Political factions recalculated strategies. One attempted to protest the bond formally, and was immediately redirected into a 3-hour administrative loop involving outdated forms, 3 languages of legal paradox, and what he later learned was a deliberately boring audit protocol used to discourage rebellion through exhaustion. He approved of that method more than he wanted to admit. At some point he asked the Queen, so what exactly am I now? Because I started this job as observer and I feel like I've been upgraded without reading the patch notes. You are an attached witness, she said. That sounds like I'm legally required to watch things happen. Yes, and if I do, a pause, her ears shifted to a calm, steady silver. Then events still occur, she said, but without your recorded interpretation. He blinked. That is the most passive-aggressive job description I've ever heard. It is efficient, she replied. He exhaled slowly. Everything here is efficient. It's starting to feel like Earth is just inefficient chaos with better snacks. For a moment, something like quiet understanding passed between them, not friendship, not yet, something more structural. Like two incompatible systems discovering a shared protocol. The aftermath of the poisoning attempt resolved itself in layers. The culprit was identified not through interrogation, but through pattern collapse analysis. A faction attempting to destabilize the Queen's rule had embedded the toxin through ceremonial supply chains across 4 translation layers and 2 diplomatic subcontracts. When the truth surfaced, the court expected punishment. Instead, the Queen reassigned them to agricultural logistics. The human found this out later and asked, "Is that worse?" A senior attendant answered without hesitation, "Yes." He nodded slowly. "That feels like punishment via paperwork." "It is," the attendant confirmed. "I respect that deeply," he said. The Queen, meanwhile, did not celebrate. She simply continued governing, and occasionally she spoke to him. At first, it was about the incident, then about his species, then about Earth. She found human behavior statistically inefficient but narratively persistent, which he decided was either an insult or the closest thing to admiration she was willing to offer. He tried explaining Earth culture in return. At one point he said, "We have something called reality television." The Queen paused for a long time, then her ears shifted slowly toward gold. "That sounds like surveillance with emotional consequences," she said. "Yeah," he admitted. "That's actually pretty accurate." After a while the court adjusted, not comfortably, but functionally. He was no longer treated as an intruder or anomaly. He was treated as a fixed variable in the Queen's authority system, which meant most people stopped trying to kill him and started trying to understand whether befriending him counted as diplomacy or insurance fraud. He preferred the first interpretation. Weeks passed. The bond stabilized. He learned its effect was not power but proximity. Any threat against him triggered jurisdictional echo responses, legal, political, sometimes even infrastructural. Doors refused to open for people who had hostile intent in their systems. Drones accidentally rerouted important files away from conspirators. Entire conversations became inexplicably boring in the presence of malicious actors. He once asked if the Queen had designed it that way. She replied, "It reduces inefficiency." He said, "You mean it annoys your enemies into giving up?" She considered, "Yes, that's honestly the most relatable monarchy I've ever encountered." Eventually, the Queen summoned him one last time to the central chamber. There was no ceremony this time, no audience, just the two of them and the quiet hum of a station that now treated him as part of its operational grammar. "You will continue as attached witness," she said. "Great," he replied. "I've grown emotionally attached to my job title, so this works out." A faint flicker of blue passed through her ears. Then she added, "You may leave the court if you wish." He blinked. "I can, yes, that feels like something you should have led with earlier. I did not assess it as relevant until now." He nodded slowly. Classic alien decision tree. He looked around the chamber, at the place where everything had changed, at the system that had quietly rewritten him without destroying him. "So what happens if I stay?" he asked. "You remain protected," she said, "and if I go back to Earth." A pause, her ears shifted to a more neutral silver. "Protection follows jurisdictional contact," she said. He frowned. "So I'd still be connected." "Yes," he sighed. "I'm starting to think I didn't win a reward I